Good afternoon. Welcome back to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. The man himself, the wonderful photographer, educator, author, Tim Gray, joining us once again. You guys should all know him by now. He's like an everyday face around here. Tim, what's going on, man?
Not much. How are you doing?
Doing wonderful. It's good to see you, and it's good to host you. I feel like I haven't hosted you in such a long time. I had to wait for Jolson to take a day off to finally get back in here.
Well, it's great to have you back with me, and as always, fun to be presenting for the B&H Photo Event Space and all the friendly folks out there.
Always a good time. And the friendly folks know the drill by now. They know that they can ask any question, almost any question. Ask any question.
Only the ones I know the answers
answer.
to.
There you go. And if he doesn't know the answer, we'll make him Google it live on the air. There you go. Well, Tim, I know you got a lot to get to, so I'm going to kick it over to you, and I'll see you in a bit for some Q&A.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. And again, thank you everybody for joining today. Welcome. And I hope that you find this presentation helpful and interesting, maybe a little entertaining, and teach you some tricks perhaps that you weren't familiar with already in Lightroom Classic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get started. And before I really get started, I do want to talk a little bit about Lightroom Classic. We are talking about synchronizing to the cloud here, and that might cause a little bit of confusion. First of all, what I hear so often from photographers, from users of technology, people in general, is what is the cloud and why do I need it? Why does it seem to be everywhere all of a sudden? And, you know, if I had to describe the cloud in one word, it would be internet. The cloud is essentially just another word for all intents and purposes for the internet, for applications perhaps that we run via the internet, for storage that we access via the internet. One of the ways that I like to describe cloud storage is that it's exactly like the hard drive you might have connected to your computer. You plug in a hard drive to your computer, you copy some files over to it. The cloud, when it comes to cloud storage, it's exactly the same thing. The only difference is that you don't have the hard drive in your possession, and it's not connected via, for example, a USB cable, but rather you're connecting to a hard drive via your internet connection. And so I'm going to be talking about using Lightroom Classic in the context of the cloud, which if you're familiar with some of the Adobe Lightroom offerings, that might also cause a little bit of confusion, in part because Adobe created some confusion when it comes to the couple of versions of Lightroom. There's sort of several versions of Lightroom. I think of it as a Lightroom ecosystem. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the notion that you need to choose, by and large, between Lightroom Classic and Lightroom, well, the one that doesn't really have another modifier, but I refer to it as Lightroom Cloud, or the cloud-based version of Lightroom. Both of these versions of Lightroom run right on your computer, but with the cloud-based version of Lightroom, your photo storage is first and foremost in the cloud. In other words, you really think of it as saving your photos on Adobe servers, and as they're needed, as you need to access your photos, they're downloaded to your computer or to your mobile device so that you can make use of them, which means that by and large, you can think of the cloud-based version of Lightroom as requiring more or less that you're connected full-time to the internet. That's not 100% true, but I think it's a good way to sort of think about how you might work with the cloud-based version of Lightroom. Lightroom Classic, which is what you see here, it's what I recommend, it's what I use for my own workflow. Lightroom Classic revolves around local storage, which means you're saving your photos on your own hard drive locally. You can organize those hard drives any way you want to, back up your hard drives, but still using Lightroom Classic, you can make use of cloud-based storage so that you can leverage some of the benefits of the cloud. I'm going to illustrate some of those for you so that you'll get a better sense of how it works and why you also, as I do, may want to make use of the cloud in conjunction with Lightroom Classic. So even though, if like me, you want to use Lightroom Classic, you don't want to use the cloud-based version of Lightroom, I think it still makes sense to leverage the cloud, to leverage internet-based storage and synchronization to streamline your workflow, to make it easier to share photos and take advantage of a wide variety of other benefits. So I want to start off talking about the basic configuration, the basic setup. It's pretty straightforward in Lightroom Classic. I'm going to go ahead and hide my video so that my face hopefully won't block the top right portion of the screen. So taking a look here in Lightroom Classic, first and foremost, we want to make sure that we have enabled synchronization to the cloud, that we've enabled cloud-based synchronization for Lightroom Classic. And I should point out right from the start that this synchronization can only be active for a single catalog. So if you're working with multiple catalogs, you'll need to choose which catalog you want to synchronize. And then up at the top right corner of the Lightroom interface, you'll find this little cloud icon, which you can click on, and that will give you a summary of the cloud storage that you're currently consuming and how much you have available based on the plan that you've signed up for. And we'll see an indication of whether or not there's any local activity versus, you can see here, everything is synchronized. So I get this check mark indicating that I am synced. But the main setting that I want you to be aware of is the pause versus play as you were. So start synchronize. So I'm going to go ahead and pause so that you can see if synchronization is not enabled, then you'll see that the button says start syncing. And of course, you can simply click on that button in order to activate synchronization for your Lightroom Classic catalog. Again, synchronization is only available for a single Lightroom Classic catalog. Hopefully, you're following my advice and only using a single Lightroom Classic catalog to begin with. But again, that first step is to enable synchronization for your catalog. And if, by the way, you have more than one catalog and you're trying to enable synchronization for a different catalog, you will get an alert message letting you know that you can only synchronize one catalog and asking, do you really want to synchronize this catalog, or do you want to keep it set to whichever other catalog had been set? But again, I strongly recommend that you avoid any confusion by having multiple catalogs and instead only use a single catalog in Lightroom Classic to manage all of your photos. It'll keep your workflow simpler. It'll make everything go a lot more smoothly. All right, so when it comes to Lightroom Classic, as opposed to the cloud-based version of Lightroom, as I mentioned, with the cloud-based version of Lightroom, your photos are stored first and foremost in the cloud, and you can think of copies being downloaded to your computer or mobile device on an as-needed basis. With Lightroom Classic, it's essentially the opposite. Your photos are stored locally. They're stored on a hard drive. Maybe you've got all your photos on an external hard drive, for example, and none of your photos by default are going to be synchronized to the cloud. But of course, we can synchronize photos to the cloud. And what I love about Lightroom Classic in this context is that we get to choose which photos are actually synchronized to the cloud. I have about 400,000 photos in my Lightroom Classic catalog. I'd like to convince you that they're all 5-star rated images. That's not exactly true, but I have a lot of pictures. I do not need all of those photos to be available in the cloud. I do not need all of those photos to be available on my smartphone, for example, or tablet, or in a web browser. That would be overwhelming and confusing. I would never be able to find a photo that I'm trying to share with somebody, for example, on my smartphone. And so instead, we want to synchronize only the photos that we actually want to have synchronization for. And so we'll start off with a very simple example. We might use synchronization to share our photos easily from virtually anywhere. So let's go ahead and synchronize some photos. And the way that works in Lightroom Classic is via a collection. So first off, let's make sure we understand that we're primarily dealing with folders. So this is just a demo catalog, but you can see I have some folders available, some photos from Austria and some photos from New York City, etc. And so I can manage those photos locally on my own hard drive, however it is, whatever folder structure that I want to use. And so the folders, the list of folders that we see in Lightroom Classic reflects the storage on our hard drive. So if I went out to my hard drive where these photos are stored, I would see the exact same folder structure. And so it literally represents the storage of my photos. Collections behave somewhat like folders, but they're not tied to a specific physical location. So think of a collection as just an album of photos, just a group of photos that you can organize in a different way. So normally I might navigate to a particular folder, for example, and take a look at my photos. But what about a situation where I want to work with photos across a variety of different folders or for a specific project? I don't want to move my photos around on the hard drive. I just want to be able to get to them a little more easily. Just as I might filter images based on a keyword or based on a star rating, for example, so too can I effectively filter photos for any purpose I might have in mind. Photos that I want to put into a calendar for next year, photos for a book that I'm working on, or just photos that I want to share with others on my smartphone. So collections are just references to the source photos being in a folder on your hard drive. So let's go ahead and create a collection. I'm going to make a collection of some favorite photos from Easter Island here. So I'll just set a filter, in this case, just using a 2-star or greater filter. And I'm going to select all of the photos here. So I'll just press Control A on Windows or Command A on Macintosh after having set whatever filter I might want to use. And then I'm going to create a brand new collection. So on the left panel in the library module, I can click on the plus button over to the right of the collections heading and choose the option to create a collection. Now, it's not mandatory that you filter photos and select photos before you create a collection. Sometimes you might not really know which photos you're going to put into the collection. You're working on a calendar and you're just kind of mix and match different photos as you come across them. But if you do know which photos that you want to put into a given collection you're creating, it can help speed up that process by first selecting the images. So in this case, I've selected the images, but if I hadn't, later I could just drag and drop photos into the collection. So I'm going to choose Create Collection from that pop-up. And note, by the way, this is a normal collection where I manually add photos to the collection. There are also smart collections where I could, for example, create a smart collection that contains all photos with a keyword of whale and with a star rating greater than or equal to 2. So my best whale photos, for example. However, those smart collections, which are basically like a saved search result, you're not able to actually synchronize those. You can only synchronize normal collections. So I'm going to create a normal collection here. I'll just call this Easter Island Favorites, for example. I can put that into a collection set if I want to help organize my collections. I have the option here, as I was talking about selecting my photos first, I can turn on the Include Selected Photos checkbox so that these selected photos, how many? I've got 12 of them selected. They'll automatically be added to this collection once I create it. I can create virtual copies. I don't generally need to do that. The only reason I would say to create virtual copies in this scenario would be if the images in the collection you want to change to be different from the originals. So let's say you're making a book, but all of the photos in the book are going to be black and white, the originals being in color. You might want to create virtual copies for these images so that then you're creating black and white versions for the book, but the originals on your hard drive still appear in color. You can set this as the target collection. That just means that you can press the letter B, as in boy, on the keyboard in order to add selected photos to this collection. And then one of the key things we're going to be talking about today, we have the option here to sync with Lightroom. In other words, to sync to the cloud. Right now, I want this checkbox turned on, except I'm not going to turn it on because I also want to show you another way that we can actually enable synchronization for the collection. So normally, since I know that I want to synchronize this collection, I would just turn on the Sync with Lightroom checkbox. I'm going to turn this off for the moment, though, just so I can show you the other option for enabling that synchronization. So I'll go ahead and click the Create button, and that will create the collection. So I'm now browsing. As you can see here, the Easter Island Favorites collection. I'm no longer browsing the folder that contains the source images, but rather a collection that just contains a subset of those images. And now I want to show you the second way that we can enable synchronization for this collection. So if we take a look at the Collections section over on the left panel here in the Library module, and you'll see my Easter Island Favorites collection, over to the left, you'll notice that there's what appears to be a checkbox. If I hover over, we get this little double-headed arrow type of an icon. That checkbox is essentially a checkbox that enables you to turn on or off the synchronization for that collection. I want to synchronize this collection, so I'll go ahead and click to turn that on, and you'll see now that double-headed arrow sort of icon is stuck, you might say. It's turned on, so that collection is now being synchronized. And if I go back up to the top right, let me turn off my camera here. If we go back up to the top right and click on that cloud, you'll see that I'm currently syncing 12 photos. And we'll see that progress will update as time goes on. Now, normally, depending on your internet speed, this is a pretty fast process. Right now, of course, while I've got a really good internet connection, I'm also hogging up that internet connection by streaming video and audio all at the same time. And so it's going to be a little bit slower than it normally would, but we'll just let that work in the background. Note that at the top right there, we have that little double-headed circular arrow icon, kind of like the recycle symbol, indicating that the synchronization is active. And so even if I don't have the pop-up here, I can still see the status, and we'll get that green circle with the check mark icon indicating that everything is synchronized once that synchronization actually is completed. And so go ahead and turn on that camera here again so that I can talk to you more directly. So we've now synchronized to the cloud. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, it means that the photos now, in addition to being stored on my hard drive, I have placeholder copies. They're not the original raw captures. They are a reduced resolution DNG file, essentially. We don't need to worry about those technical details, but they are proxies for our images. They're not the originals, they're just references. And so we can go now and review those images in a variety of ways. So perhaps I want to share some images with others, for example. Well, let's take a look at my smartphone here. So I'm sharing my smartphone screen. This is the Lightroom mobile app. It's part of that overall Lightroom ecosystem that I made reference to. And a common misunderstanding is that the Lightroom mobile app is only for those who are using the cloud-based version of Lightroom. That's not the case at all. It is, in fact, for anyone who's using essentially any app within the Lightroom ecosystem. And so if we are using Lightroom Cloud or Lightroom Classic, we still have the ability to make use of this cloud-based synchronization. And so I can go through and review these photos. I could, share images with others, for example, play a little slideshow on my device, whatever the case might be. And so these are the photos. You can kind of see the references, the source images, as it were, in the background in Lightroom Classic on my computer. And I'm just sharing the screen here for my smartphone so that you can see those same images synchronized to the cloud so that I can access them through any app in the Lightroom ecosystem, essentially. That includes the cloud-based version of Lightroom. I don't recommend using the cloud-based version of Lightroom, the desktop app, if you're using Lightroom Classic, because it is bound to cause confusion. But I'll show you some other examples here of how we can make use of the overall ecosystem, the Lightroom app, and something else, which I think is pretty cool. So again, I'm browsing, in this case, these collections. In fact, let me go back here, and you'll see down at toward the bottom of the screen, albums. So in the context of everywhere else in the Lightroom ecosystem, except Lightroom Classic, we have what are called albums. The equivalent in Lightroom Classic would be collections. And so I have that one collection that's been synchronized, and I can go browse that collection of images at any time. But wait, there's more. If you also have a web browser installed on your computer or on anyone's computer, you can sign in to lightroom.adobe.com using your same Adobe Creative Cloud ID that you would use to activate on your desktop or to sign in on the mobile version on a mobile device. And once again, you can see that I have my collection. So I have the album here, Easter Island Favorites, and I can browse and make updates and changes and do all sorts of different things. And in fact, let's go back to, let's see, how about this image here? Maybe I want to apply some adjustments to. One of the things to keep in mind when it comes to reviewing your images, to working with your images anywhere within the Lightroom ecosystem, remember, we're dealing with synchronized photos right now. And so let's go ahead and make a change. I'll go into the adjustments here. That'll load up my image. And I'm just going to apply a quick change to set this image to black and white. And then we'll close out, and you'll see that my preview here in just a moment. Again, I'm in a web browser. So this could be from any computer that has an internet connection. I could be traveling in a hotel in the business center and make use of their computer. I could borrow a friend's computer. I can pull up a web browser anywhere with an internet connection, sign into lightroom.adobe.com, and have access to my synchronized photos. And of course, so now I've converted this image to black and white. Let's get back to the desktop version of Lightroom Classic. And it's this photo over here. Synchronization has not updated just yet. But if we, while we're waiting, oh, there, it just caught up as I was about to switch. So let me come back to that. Here is that synchronized version. So I made a change, a simple conversion to black and white for this image in my web browser using lightroom.adobe.com, that change gets synchronized across all portions of the ecosystem. And so here, Lightroom Classic on my desktop, or if we come back to my smartphone, and there is that same photo with the updates having been synchronized as well. And I should hasten to point out that it's not just adjustments, of course, metadata updates. That's a little bit limited in the context of the mobile app or your web browser. But for example, we can adjust star ratings, and I'll talk a little bit more about the potential for that workflow later. But for star ratings, we swipe on the left side of the image when we're in the review mode here. For pick and reject flags, that's over on the right side of the screen. But I can drag upward and downward on the left side of the screen. So let's just make that a 4-star rated image just for fun. That change will be uploaded from my smartphone to the cloud, and from the cloud back down to Lightroom Classic on my desktop or back to my web browser, as the case may be. And so once all of that synchronization has actually caught up with itself, then we'll be able to see that the change is reflected. Let's go see if our web browser has caught up. I'll refresh my browser here, and we can see, yes, sure enough, down at the bottom center, we have the 4-star rating that is updated. Did we get that yet? Yes, we did. You can see the 4 stars on the thumbnail here or on the toolbar down below the image preview area. I'll switch to the grid view. You can see the star rating there as well. So again, the changes are synchronized as well as the images themselves. So not only is this a handy tool for being able to share our images from virtually anywhere very easily, but we can also make changes. We can review metadata or apply adjustments to our images, and that will all be synchronized as well. And I mentioned, let's go find another photo that maybe did not get added. So here's a little landscape shot, essentially, of the quarry where a lot of the Moai statues were carved on Easter Island. This image was not included in that collection. Let's assume I want to add it to the collection. So over on the left panel, you can see, again, my Easter Island favorites collection with 12 images with synchronization enabled. If I drag and drop that additional photo into the collection count goes up to 13. And let's switch over to my smartphone, for example, and we will patiently wait. Well, maybe not too patiently. We'll give it a moment here and see if it catches up quickly enough with itself. But we'll see those changes. So as I add an image to a synchronized collection, that will, of course, be reflected within the Lightroom mobile app, as well as the web browser. You can see well, actually my face is probably blocking. At the top right, we can see that the synchronization is not finished yet. And so the photo has not made it up to the cloud just yet. Therefore, of course, it's not going to make it back down from the cloud on my smartphone, on my mobile device, or within my web browser. And so I think important to keep in mind that the timing can be a little bit slow depending on your internet connection. But there we go. As I'm speaking, there is the photo that has made it to my smartphone. And so if I go refresh my browser, let's close that image and refresh my browser here just to make sure. And where to go? Right over there it is. So there is that photo that was added to the collection, the synchronized collection. So now it too populates into that overall cloud-based ecosystem. And again, part of what I consider to be the real advantage of Lightroom Classic in this regard is that I'm able to pick and choose which photos. So I don't have to synchronize all 400,000 of my photos to the cloud and then hope that on my smartphone that I can find one particular image that I'm looking for. Rather, I can create collections and only enable synchronization for the collections that I actually want to make available from virtually anywhere with an internet connection using, again, Lightroom, obviously on my computer using Lightroom Classic, Lightroom from virtually anywhere in a web browser by going to lightroom.adobe.com, and of course using the Lightroom mobile app on your web browser, well, on any web browser, anyone's web browser, so that you can really access from virtually anywhere. Now, I do want to talk about a little caveat, a little challenge as it relates to synchronizing photos to the cloud. And that is that once you synchronize to the cloud, in effect, the photos remain in the cloud forever until you actually remove them. And so, for example, if we take a look, let me switch to the grid view display and make sure I'm in that Easter Island favorites collection. These photos are in the cloud. And they got to the cloud because I turned on synchronization for the collection. So again, that little checkbox of sorts over to the left of the collection itself on the left panel in the library module. And so these photos are synchronized. If I turn off synchronization for the collection, you're not exactly going to get the behavior you might expect, and you're not going to get the behavior that I think should take effect. I'm going to go ahead and turn off synchronization, and we won't worry about this error message because I'm going to talk to you about what's going on here. I'm going to stop that synchronization. So I still have my collection. I could still reference these photos for a particular project, for example, but you can see now the checkbox over to the left of the collection is empty. Those photos are not synchronized. So let's go back to my web browser and back to our grid view display, and I'll refresh, and the photos are still there. You might notice under albums, over on the left panel here within my web browser, there's no albums. So that Easter Island Favorites album that I created, that disappeared because I turned off synchronization for that collection/album, but the photos remain. Let's go to my smartphone here, and we'll go back to our home page here, as it were, and we'll see once again down under albums, we don't have any albums, or more to the point, my Easter Island Favorites album or collection has disappeared. And yet, if I go to all photos, the photos remain. This is something that really bothers me about the synchronization to the Creative Cloud, in that you really need to manage the removal of photos from the cloud. Otherwise, going to your cloud-based storage, so if you go to Lightroom on a mobile app or in a web browser, for example, you're going to be confused more than likely. At least I think it's very confusing. In order to accomplish that, in order to keep that kind of tidy, you need to manage the process, unfortunately. Hopefully Adobe will change the way this works in a future update. My fingers are crossed. But in the meantime, we do have to manage this process somewhat carefully. And so what I recommend is that when you're going to effectively remove photos from the Creative Cloud, in other words, from that synchronization, you want to mark them in some way. And so you could, for example, use a color label, or you could use pick or reject flag, for example. You could use some sort of metadata, a way that you could filter the images later. And so I'll go ahead and in the grid view display here, so I'm browsing that collection of photos, the Easter Island Favorites collection. And if I select all of these photos, I can still mark them in some way. So maybe I want to mark them with a yellow label. Maybe that will indicate to me that these are photos that I'm turning synchronization off for. And with that color label assigned, then when we go into the all synced photographs collection, where, as you might have guessed from the name, all of our synchronized photographs are reflected, we'll see the, in this case, yellow color label. So using some method to mark which images. Now here, I've made the task really easy on myself, because for this catalog that I've synchronized, that I've enabled synchronization for, literally the only photos that I synchronized was one collection containing, in this case, 13 images. So pretty straightforward to figure out which images are synchronized. It's essentially all of the synchronized photographs are from a single collection. So normally I would have added this color label before I turned off synchronization for the collection. It's not necessary, but just as a workflow, just as a best practice, I think that is a smarter move. And then we can go to all synced photographs, where, in fact, just to make this a little bit more clear, let's go ahead and enable synchronization for this group of Austria favorites. So some favorite photos from Austria. Now, when we go to all synced photographs, you'll see that I have my Easter Island images as well as my Austria images. And so if I had not assigned a color label, you can appreciate how difficult it might be and how potentially confusing it might be to try to keep this orderly, to try to avoid having just a mess of photos that are synchronized in the cloud. Because again, remember, let's go take a look at my phone here. And hasn't caught up with the synchronization yet. Let's see if the browser has. I think it's still uploading those images, so we might not see. I hear a few of them starting to show up here. The Austria photos starting to show up. And so this could be very confusing, where some of these photos are in a synchronized collection. That would be the Austria images. And the Easter Island images are no longer in a synchronized collection. They're in a collection, but synchronization is not enabled for them. And so especially if you've synchronized a large number of photos from a large number of collections, this can become a real mess if you don't stay on top of the process. So switching back to Lightroom Classic on the desktop, again, when I'm going to disable synchronization for a collection, I recommend that you mark the photos in some way so that when you go to now remove them, as I wish Adobe would just do for you automatically when you disable synchronization for a collection, you'll know which photos need to be removed. So I've disabled synchronization, but the photos remain in the cloud. And we know that because they appear in this all synced photographs collection. But since I marked, in this case, the Easter Island photos with that yellow color label, I know that those are the images that I don't want in the cloud. I chose to stop synchronizing the collection that contains these photos. So I certainly don't want them cluttering up my cloud-based storage. The problem is I have to do that myself. So I'll select the images that I've marked with that yellow color label to help me avoid any confusion about which photos need to be removed. And then with those images selected, so I've selected all of the yellow color label images here in this case, I can right click on any of the selected images and then choose the option down here toward the bottom of the pop-up menu. So right click on any of the selected photos and then choose remove from all synced photographs, which is a reference to that collection in the catalog section. And this, by the way, this is an automatic collection. It's created automatically when you have synchronized photos. You don't create it in the collections section of the left panel. So it's just sort of perpetual as long as you've actually synchronized photos. But I'm going to now remove those photos from synced photographs, from all synced photographs. And that, as the dialogue there was actually confirming, will not only remove them from this all synced photographs collection, it will also remove them from my cloud-based storage. Again, I hope Adobe, if there's anyone from Adobe listening, maybe fix that for me, because I'd prefer that that not be an extra step that I have to take. If I've turned off synchronization, I want the images removed. And then once the synchronization is complete, let's see if we've caught up with ourselves here yet. And we have. So now I have only the Austria photos, including the collection or album, as it were. But because I removed my Easter Island photos, in this case, from that all synced photographs collection, they also are removed from our Lightroom cloud ecosystem here on my mobile device, Lightroom on a mobile device. Similarly, you can see that now I have all of those Austria photos from the Austria collection, but I no longer have the photos from that Easter Island collection. Now, there's also an option to go essentially in the other direction, and that is to go from a mobile device to your Lightroom Classic catalog. And so I want to go into Lightroom Classic first and foremost, and we're going to configure this. Now, by default, it can also be a little bit confusing the way this is implemented, because, for example, if you bring photos into your workflow using a mobile device, then you'll essentially see that mobile device as a hard drive within Lightroom Classic. And that can be confusing because it's not a hard drive that's connected to your computer, but it's the way it gets represented. So I want to show you a couple of things related to the ability to change that default behavior that I think is a little bit more helpful and meaningful. And so first off, we're going to go into preferences. So for Macintosh users, you would go to the Lightroom Classic menu on the menu bar. Windows users would go to the edit menu and then choose preferences. And within preferences, we want to go to the Lightroom Sync tab. And then we want to specify a location for Lightroom's synced images, meaning not photos that you're synchronizing from a collection in Lightroom Classic, but photos that you're synchronizing in the other direction. And I'll demonstrate that here in just a moment if you're not familiar with that option. So we're going to take photos from my mobile device and send them to Lightroom Classic, which is a pretty cool feature. If you're a fan of using the cloud, if you have a good fast internet connection most of the time, this can work out quite easily, quite nicely. And so instead of the default setting, I want to click to specify a location, and we can then choose exactly where we would like those to go. I'm going to click the choose button, and well, we have them here going into the Lightroom folder, and I'll call that, well, actually, I'm going to put them into a new folder, and I'm going to call that iPhone mobile to sort, for example, and we'll choose that as my destination. And this is just a dialog letting me know that I'm changing locations. I don't have any existing photos that have been moved in this way, so we don't need to worry about that. And then if I want to, I can also use subfolders formatted by capture date. I'm not a date person. I don't know today's date. And so for me, I don't remember or manage or organize my photos by date. And instead, I'm going to treat this download location, as I'll demonstrate here in just a moment. I'm going to treat that as a temporary storage location, a place to store my photos from my mobile device until I have put them in their proper place, essentially. And again, we'll go through that workflow so that if you're not familiar with this process, that will make sense shortly. But the point is that I can choose exactly where I want my photos that are getting to the cloud somewhere other than Lightroom Classic, where I would like them to be stored so that I can make use of them. I'm going to close that preferences dialog, and we will switch to my mobile device here, where, in fact, let me close out of this. Within the Lightroom mobile app, you'll see that we have a set of buttons at the bottom. The left side, that's to import photos from your device. So from the camera roll, as it were, from the photos on my device that I've already captured, or the Lightroom mobile app includes a camera feature so that you can capture photos directly with the Lightroom mobile app. So I'm going to make use of that feature. I'll go ahead and tap to enter into the camera mode here. I've got my phone just set against my desktop here, so it's just going to be a black picture. I'm not going to take a selfie. You're welcome. But we could adjust our various settings for the camera. And note, by the way, as you can see at the top center, we're capturing in the Adobe DNG format. So a good quality capture that we're creating. Down toward the bottom, you can see that we're able to adjust a variety of settings. And so I'm just going to capture a photo here. So I'll tap the shutter release button. A photo is captured. I'll go ahead and close the camera. And here is my noisy, I can't even say beautiful. All it is a noisy sample photo that I've captured for illustrative purposes. And so this is a photo that I have actually captured directly on my mobile device. So on my smartphone in this particular case. And that photo will, of course, synchronize via the Lightroom Creative Cloud. So to my cloud-based storage, there's a little cloud icon you can see at the top right. See the little flashing dots indicating that that upload is active. There's a check mark indicating now that it is complete. And so we should, let's go ahead and go to our web browser, for example, and I'll refresh. And if that, yes, it has caught up with itself, we have that noisy looking photo available within our web browser. And we've not quite yet finished the synchronization to the desktop here. You can see it's gotten part of the way there. So I have the iPhone mobile to sort folder that I created as well. Here comes that photo. But here's the folder that I created as part of that preferences setting so that this becomes the location where any of these mobile captures will automatically appear in my normal storage structure, not under a different heading. So you can see I've got my hard drive indicated here. If I had not created a specific folder for the synchronization purpose, then essentially my iPhone in this case would appear as another heading, just like the Macintosh hard drive in this case, which can be a little bit confusing. And the local storage is the sort of random folder structure. So things can get to be a little bit confusing if you don't update that folder to choose a folder of your own. And again, I recommend that you use what is essentially just kind of a temporary holding place for photos that I need to organize in some way. And so let's assume, let's see, I've got my more recent set of photos is from the Palouse 2022. Let's pretend that my photo captured on my smartphone is one of those images. Well, once again, I want to try to stay organized with this process. So I essentially have two things that I want to accomplish. One is to put this photo, well, probably it would be more than just one photo, but however many photos it might be, I want to put that photo in its proper location in terms of storage. And I also want to remove it from the cloud. There's no sense in having this image still in the cloud when I've put it into my normal workflow within Lightroom Classic. And so I can move this, in this case, one photo. It could be a large number of photos as well, but I'll simply select the photos that I want to move, and then I can drag and drop, just as I would move a photo otherwise within Lightroom Classic from one storage location to another. But remember that issue of the photo still remaining in cloud-based storage. So I want to mark it in some way so that I know which photos I need to remove from synchronization. So once again, I can use that yellow color label or any metadata that you choose. I think color labels are very helpful for this purpose, in part because they sort of stand out. So I'll mark the photos first with a yellow color label, then move them to where I really want them. I'll click the move button to confirm that I want to move the photo. The photo will indeed, if I scroll down here, will appear within that Palouse 2022 folder. However, if I go back to my web browser and refresh, or you see the photo is still there, or if I go back to my mobile device, you'll see down at the bottom here, the last photo on the list, the image is still there. It's still in the cloud, even though I moved it onto my hard drive, into my local photo storage. And so now that I've moved that photo into the location where I want it, I no longer need the photo to be synchronized. And so I can go back to all synced photographs, find my yellow color labels. I could set a filter based on yellow color label, for example, and then select the images in question. Here, I made it easy on myself. It's only one photo. Right click, and then remove from all synced photographs. The photo will remain. And so if I go back to my Palouse 2022 folder representing the hard drive, that not so beautiful, noisy, but important demonstration image is still in that folder on my hard drive. When I back up my hard drive, this photo gets backed up, etc. But if I go to all synced photographs, you will no longer see that image. If I go back to my web browser and refresh, you will no longer see that image. And if we go back to my mobile device here, once it refreshes, so we're still waiting for this one to finish synchronizing. 11 are in the collection. So once that actually refreshes, then we'll see the image. There it goes, just disappeared for me. Thank goodness that it disappeared before I ran out of time here. But again, that same basic concept that we talked about earlier, where we can remove photos from the cloud once we've gotten them where we want them otherwise within our overall workflow. And I want to demonstrate, I talked about the ability to assign star ratings. I want to talk about another scenario where you might make use of this cloud-based synchronization. So we've already seen two, I think, very important, very helpful options. Number one is to synchronize a collection to the cloud so that you can maybe share photos with others during your travels, for example. And the other would be to take mobile captures using the Lightroom app on a smartphone or tablet and have those automatically come into your workflow within Lightroom Classic on the desktop. And then in both cases, being able to manage that process so that when you are finished working with the photos, you'll remove them from cloud storage. So they're not creating clutter or taking up your cloud-based storage. But there's another related workflow scenario that I think you might find helpful, and that is to be able to essentially review your photos on the go. And I demonstrated this very briefly with a previous example, but let's go ahead and just import some photos. I want to show you one of the things that we can do to help to streamline the overall process here. And so I'm going to go ahead and click the import button. And so I've got a media card in the card reader, and I've got my destination set, and I'm copying these photos, and I'll go ahead and leave that metadata assigned as it is. And I'm going to create a folder here. So these happen to be some photos from a trip to Italy in 2018, and I'm just configuring my overall settings. Obviously, we're not going to talk about every detail in the import dialog. Hopefully, you're already familiar with importing your photos. But this is a scenario. What I'm going to demonstrate here is a scenario where you actually might want to add photos to a collection on import. Normally, I don't want to add all of the photos that I'm currently importing to a collection because there's not much of an advantage. I haven't even sorted to identify my favorites yet. But that's where this workflow comes into play. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the Add to Collection checkbox, and I'll click the plus button over here to the right in order to create a new collection. And we'll call this Italy to review, for example. And then I'll go ahead and synchronize with Lightroom, the overall Lightroom ecosystem of that cloud-based storage. So as we saw earlier in this presentation, I created a collection and added photos to that collection and enabled synchronization. Here, as part of the import process, I can also add images to a collection. So actually, just in case my camera was blocking that, if my face was blocking. So over here in the file handling section on the right panel in the import dialog, we can turn on the add to collection checkbox, click the plus symbol, and then configure that collection. So give it a name, and in this case, enabling that synchronization, sync with Lightroom. So I'll go ahead and click the create button, and then we'll assume at that point that we have all of our settings adjusted just fine for the import. Most important for our demo at the moment is just that collection. So I'm adding these photos on import to a synchronized collection. I'll go ahead and click the import button, and you'll see here's my current import collection. And right down here, you can see that Italy 2018 folder that includes those images. So just a handful of them have made it thus far. And we have an Italy to review collection with synchronization already enabled. So we don't have any images in that collection just yet. We're still copying the photos. Let's go back to the folder. Up here is the collection updated. So I've got 45 images in the collection. I believe, how many do we have? Are we only up to 45? Maybe it was only, yeah, I guess it was only 45 images to import. So that's all the photos. They've made it, of course, to the storage location where I've designated that I want these images to be stored. They're also added to a collection that has synchronization enabled. So the idea is I'm traveling to Italy and I'm planning on reviewing these photos on the long flight home, for example. And so I'm going to add these photos to a synchronized collection. And then, of course, once that synchronization is finished, I'm just going to check real quick. So we're still synchronizing. None of those photos have gotten to the cloud just yet. Still working on it. I'll synchronize here, or refreshed, I should say, in my web browser. We're not quite there, but we'll keep checking. And before too long, these photos will have synchronized. In fact, you can see here the Italy to review album / collection is already there. And so now I've imported photos, and as part of that import process, essentially enabled synchronization for those images so they'll be in the cloud. Why is this so helpful? Well, it comes back to that ability, as I mentioned earlier, to adjust star ratings on the fly. I did that initially just to demonstrate, look, if I make a change, it synchronizes all the way through the Lightroom ecosystem so that if I change an image to black and white or update a star rating on my mobile device, for example, that will get synchronized to my catalog in Lightroom Classic on my desktop. But the same is true when it comes to, of course, reviewing these photos. And so let's refresh once again, see if any of our photos have made it there. Yes, we've got some, maybe not all yet, looks like. No, we're still a little bit shy, but we've got most of the photos here that have synchronized. And so now, once this is synchronized, I'll go to my mobile device right here, and you can see I'm not totally synchronized just yet. I'm up to 36 out of, it was 45 images that I actually enabled for synchronization. So again, they need to synchronize via the internet, depending on the speed of your connection. That could take a little bit of time. But now let's just pretend we're almost there. I just saw it updated to 41, 43 now, and 45. So now I actually do have all of my images on my smartphone. Same could be true for a tablet, because as I mentioned, I want to review these photos on the flight home. But on the flight home, it's not necessarily going to be convenient to have my laptop out, maybe have a hard drive out on my tray table. And so I could simply use my mobile device. And so I can go through those images and, for example, assign star ratings. So there's a 1 star, and then just swipe across and give that a 1 star. And that's just the moon. Ooh, that's kind of a nice looking door. We'll give that one 2 stars. And again, going through and identifying my favorite photos, maybe my outtake photos. I could, for example, well, maybe the moon, for example, which wasn't much to speak of. On the right side, I can get my pick and reject flag, so I can mark that as a rejected image, so that once I've landed back home and I allow my smartphone to synchronize to the cloud, then when I get back to those images, and we'll see, yes, so we can see here, there is well, let's go back to the grid view so you can see more readily. There's the 1-star rating that I assigned there, and the reject flag hasn't yet popped up for that image. There's the 2-star rating for that image, and 1 star over there up. And now I see that the reject flag has updated. So I can actually use the synchronization to help streamline my workflow using, for example, a smartphone or a tablet to review my photos that I've synchronized, assign star ratings, and pick or reject flags, for example, and then obviously later on continue with my normal workflow on the computer. All right. And so there you have it. So the key thing I think to keep in mind is that by synchronizing photos to the cloud, we have those photos, specific photos that we've selected to synchronize, available from virtually anywhere with an internet connection, whether it's on your computer using your Lightroom Classic catalog, on your smartphone or tablet using the Lightroom mobile app, or using a web browser to visit lightroom.adobe.com in order to be able to access all of your synchronized photos and really take that workflow that for many of us started off being only at our computer and truly enable us to have that workflow take us to anywhere for sharing, organizing, and even optimizing our photos. So with that, I want to thank you for joining me today for this presentation. If you want to learn more about everything that I've got going on, my various classes, events, my email newsletter, the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter that I've been publishing now for over 20 years, a good place to get started is timgrayphoto.com, where you can link to my various websites and, of course, my social media if you want to follow me on Instagram or Facebook, etc. So again, thank you very much. I'd be happy if we've got any questions that have come up along the way. I'd be more than happy to address some of those.
Of course. You know, we always get a ton of questions when you're on, Tim. We're gonna start here with it's
I don't explain things clear enough, and so it leads to questions.
I knew you were going there. I was like, I know he's gonna say it. I was like, no, it's like I think you just open up Pandora's box whenever you go into Lightroom stuff. It's like you can't talk about Lightroom and not have a million questions, because as much as information as you give and as much as you answer, it only just leads to more questions. So
absolutely.
We'll get the fun started here with a question from Marta joining us from Facebook. Marta's asking if you can use other cloud storage other than Adobe. And she followed up on this asking, basically, she has iCloud and Dropbox. She essentially wants to know if she can somehow link them to avoid paying for storage in multiple places.
Sort of. So the first part of that was going to be a little bit easier. Now trying to avoid paying for multiple services, that maybe complicates it, because you can't really, link the storage and, fake Dropbox into using your Creative Cloud storage, for example. But what you can do in the context of things like Dropbox and Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive, so these various cloud-based synchronization services, which really are more about file synchronization. So they're not specifically photo synchronization. And so let me bring up a window here just to illustrate the concept. And so, for example, I have photos, well, not photos per se, I have files that I have synchronized via Dropbox. And I have the iCloud drive here, OneDrive from Microsoft. So these various cloud-based storage services, you can store photos in these locations and import, because all of them essentially, we think of them as cloud-based storage, but it's really local storage that it's being synchronized to the cloud. And so almost you can think of it as a backup of sorts. But the idea is, with any of these services, Dropbox, OneDrive, iCloud Drive, Google Drive, is that we can copy files, they might be photos, they might be documents, into that location on our hard drive. And now they're synchronized to the cloud, very similar to the Lightroom sync that we've been talking about. And now they're available from virtually anywhere. You can go to Dropbox in a web browser, you can go to the Dropbox app on your mobile device. And it is possible to use those storage facilities for your photos. It's not something that I recommend too highly unless you're super familiar with how all of that works. But because it is referencing a local folder structure, you can import. So if I put a folder full of photos here into my Dropbox, in this case folder, or any of those other cloud-based storage services, I could then import photos into Lightroom Classic from this location. One of the reasons I don't really recommend that is that it's too easy, because you can access these files from virtually anywhere. outside of Lightroom Classic, it's too easy to forget that they're part of your Lightroom Classic ecosystem and to remove them unintentionally, and then they're gone from everywhere forever. Well, you know, you've got some degree of margin for being able to undelete later. But the point is that, yes, you can use cloud-based storage in that type of context. It's just not something that I really recommend.
Okay, perfect. Our next question coming from Renee on Vimeo asking, can you export from the Lightroom mobile app or a web browser?
Yes, so you essentially download. So you can save the
Okay.
photos, and so you can download from the web browser to your local computer. Just keep in mind that those are not the original photos, as I mentioned early on. They are Adobe DNG files that are about 2,500. I forget the specific number, but it's real close. It's not a round number, but it's real close to 2,500 pixels on the long side. But yes, you can indeed save them to your device or download them from the web browser.
Perfect. Sergio joining us from Vimeo is asking, can you explain why you do not recommend using both Lightroom Classic and Lightroom Cloud on the same machine?
Confusion.
That was easiest answer yet.
Right. Yeah. And it can be done. And if you're very familiar with both applications, you most certainly can work with them in a very similar way. Just as I was accessing my synchronized photos via the Lightroom mobile app, so too could I bring up the Lightroom Cloud app and work with photos directly from there. So a couple of things. Number one, why? Why would you, when there's, you know, no necessarily benefit to using the cloud-based version of Lightroom if you're also synchronizing? If you're using Lightroom Classic as your primary storage, your primary tool for managing images, you could access them directly in Lightroom Classic. So why even bother bringing up Lightroom, the cloud-based version? But more to the point is that there's a risk of creating confusion. For example, when you're going to import new photos, you might accidentally import them into the cloud-based version rather than the classic version. Not that that's insurmountable, but it does start to muddy up the waters of your workflow and create potentially, you know, significant confusion, and the risk that you'll think, oh, these are in the cloud, I can remove them, but that might be the only versions of the photos if you've imported them, for example, into Lightroom, the mobile version, well, Lightroom, the cloud-based version.
And that seems to be what a lot of the people are asking questions about, is this kind of this fear of, if I delete it from here, does it delete there? We had a question from Dave joining us on Vimeo. If you delete a photo from a collection, will it be deleted everywhere?
It will not. And whereas if you're working in the purely cloud-based ecosystem, so Lightroom cloud-based, Lightroom mobile, there, if you were not using Lightroom Classic at all, in the context of cloud-based storage, deleting is from everywhere. Whereas with Lightroom Classic, if you're working with synchronized files, by definition, if you otherwise have them in your Lightroom workflow, your Lightroom Classic workflow, those synchronized versions are proxies. They're copies of the originals, you could say. And so if I were to delete photos, which really would be remove rather than delete, but if I remove photos from a collection, if I remove a collection altogether, if I remove every photo from my synchronized collections, the way I approach my workflow, that's of no consequence in terms of losing my photos altogether. It just means that I might be missing an advantage of having those synchronized photos available from virtually anywhere with an internet connection. And so if you're using Lightroom Classic as the core of your overall workflow, to me, that's where everything should exist first and foremost. Anything else is sort of extra, you might say. But if you're leaving photos on your hard drive, so here's, you know, all my folders on the hard drive, as long as I don't remove / delete from those locations, then all of my photos are safe. Anything I do in the context of collections will not harm the original photo in the context of a Lightroom Classic-based workflow.
Okay. Can I ask you a general, overreaching question, Tim? As far as your personal workflow, how do you use the cloud? Because I mean, I personally, I use the cloud for iPhone photos, just as like kind of
Right.
like a, just in case, you know, something wouldn't happen, something happened and all my hard drives just went poof. I use the RAID drive. I use multiple external SSDs. And the cloud is really just for that. Do you use the cloud for your actual work? And if so, how do you use it, or what do you put there?
I guess the way you've asked the question, the answer would be no. You know, for my work, for my real work, I'm not using cloud as primary storage. I'm using the cloud as an accessory to my workflow. And so for me, everything revolves around local storage using Lightroom Classic with my photos stored on external hard drives, which I back up to another external hard drive. And then I back up to another external hard drive, so that I've got local copies of all of my photos, and I try to keep those at different physical locations, etc. The cloud to me is a supplement, is an accessory. So for example, I use cloud-based backup. I happen to use Backblaze to back up my local storage to the cloud. It's not the fastest backup when it comes to initially backing up lots and lots of photos, but once you've caught up with that and you download new photos, for example, it's reasonably quick. And so that's a backup that gives me a remote backup. So worst case scenario, I lose all of my hard drives in a terrible accident, I still have something to fall back on. And then, as we've been talking about here in Lightroom Classic, I just use the cloud for convenience. And so it's to make photos available to share very easily. And so very often, when I'm traveling somewhere, if I knew I were going to Italy, for example, which I made a number of visits to, and then I might be inclined to take a bunch of my favorite photos from Italy and synchronize them to a collection/album so that they're on my phone within the Lightroom app as an album. Because when I'm visiting Italy, I know there's a chance I'm going to be with my camera and another photographer is going to strike up a conversation, and he might ask about a particular subject, and I can say, oh yeah, here's a photo of that subject, and I can give him some recommendations or what have you. And also, as I mentioned, the image review, if I think I'm going to have the energy on a long flight to actually review my photos on the trip home, then I'll make use of that, again, just as a supplement. The cloud is not sort of the core, the center of my workflow. But as we've seen, that's why part of the reason I don't use the cloud-based version of Lightroom. But as I've hopefully demonstrated today, there are some benefits to using the cloud, where even if you're only using it intermittently, periodically for special projects or just for sharing photos kind of on the fly, they can be really advantageous, and it can enable you to leverage the benefits of cloud-based storage within the context of Lightroom Classic workflow without what I consider to be the overwhelming potential for confusion and clutter in a purely cloud-based workflow. And I should mention also, you made reference to iCloud PhotoSync. I don't use iCloud PhotoSync because I don't have photos on my iPhone, which is to say that I treat my iPhone as any other camera. The real reason I have an iPhone is for taking pictures. Not, the real pictures. I've got my SLR, I've got my expensive camera with the heavy lenses and all that for taking the real pictures, but I still capture a lot of photos on my smartphone, and I treat that as just another camera. And so at any given time, I have very few photos on my iPhone, because at the end of the day, for example, when I'm traveling, I download the photos from the iPhone, put them into my normal Lightroom Classic workflow, and delete them from my iPhone. So even though cloud-based synchronization can provide that additional backup, I'm pretty comfortable with my overall backup approach using Lightroom Classic, and I don't need the clutter of thousands and thousands of photos sitting on my iPhone at any given time. Only the ones that I want to synchronize for purposes of sharing or reviewing, for example.
All right, so 80,000 pictures in my camera roll is a little too much. Got it.
That's a bit much. Yeah, I'm going to say it's a bit much.
Let's say,
but I'm sure they're all beautiful.
They're all, half of it is screen grabs of people's faces zoomed in and memes. So
exactly.
Oh man.
Well,
that's a conversation for another day. We'll wait until Scott's back for that one. But this is the perfect screen to be up right now, because as you guys probably could imagine, we just had way too many questions for us to get to. I did notice that a lot of them were centered around deleting and not wanting to lose your images and really working out that workflow. So I don't know, maybe we can get Tim back one day just to do a Q&A session on storage and Lightroom and all that together, and just keep it simple. Tim doesn't do a presentation. Just come on here and ask you questions.
Just hang out.
So just hang out. There we go. We'll do a hangout. We'll get Scott in here as well. We'll get the whole family around.
Excellent.
So I saved all of your questions for all of you who did not have your question answered. I do apologize. We only have an hour here, so we like to give that full hour to Tim to get the information disseminated, and then we try to answer as many questions as possible. But I did hold on to those. You have Tim's information right there, a great source of information regarding this, and a great guy, as you guys all see. So feel free to reach out. Tim, what do you have going on as far as workshops and the like on your side?
Well, I've got a couple of events that I'm participating in, a Lightroom Virtual Summit. Those will be on my email list. Of maybe seen me writing about that. My Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, which you can sign up for at asktimgray.com. There's a little field on the right-hand side to join that mailing list so that you'll get the latest updates. That's really the best way, I would say, to keep up with everything that I'm doing. We are producing a pretty large volume of new video content coming up that'll be released over the next couple of months, including, I mentioned backup. There have been some changes to the backup software that I use as my primary tool, and that's GoodSync. And I've got a new course coming out on that. And then a little bit later in the year, we'll also be having a couple of special events, online virtual events, as well as some online workshops. It would be longer form, kind of small group, very one-on-one, lots of direct help with the challenges, primarily related to Lightroom Classic, because that's been a popular subject, but also Photoshop. So a lot going on between now and the end of the year, to be sure.
Awesome. So I will double down on that for all of you out there watching. Definitely check that out. Sign up for the email list. That really is, if you're having trouble with Lightroom, it's the best way to go. There's a lot of free information out there on the internet, especially here on the B&H event space. But sometimes you just got to take that extra step. You have to invest in yourself as a creative, even if you're not doing it professionally. Falling behind on organization, it's miserable. And sometimes you just have to take that plunge and say, you know what, I'm going to do a workshop. I'm going to do a crash course, a boot camp, something. Tim's the guy. He's great at it. He's super knowledgeable, and you're never going to feel like you shouldn't be asking questions or feel like you're stupid for asking a question. Tim, you make it very easy and very, what's the word I'm looking for? Approachable. So thank you for that. It's always great having you on. You're one of our wonderful, respected faces that we love having back time and time again. So look for Tim in the near future. It's always good to have you. We always get happy when I see Tim, and I'm like, all right, I know we're gonna have fun. It's gonna be a nice loose hour. We're gonna learn something. Although if you're me, you're just gonna get even more confused because Lightroom still baffles me. But Tim,
we can work on that
so much. We'll work on it. I pay attention. That's why I love that I can just like shut my mic and my camera off, and I can just watch. And I'm still sitting here.
Right.
Then I know everyone else is. So I'm like, I gotta get to the people's questions. I gotta leave my questions to the side. So huge thank you again, Tim. Of course, all of our viewers out there, you guys have Tim's information right there. Definitely check him out, sign up for that email list, and see what he has to offer. He definitely can help you out. But alas, that's all we have today. Another rendition of the B&H virtual event space comes to an end and is in the books. We'll catch y'all next time.